Everyone. It's very nice to be here online with you on this December evening. My name is Ania, and I am indeed an independent researcher, curator, and writer. I'm educated as an architect in Poland and also here in the Netherlands, where I live and work for the last years. And since 2014, I am a co-founder and co-creator of the platform Amateur Cities, which is a research and publishing platform that looks at different ways of thinking about cities that are more interdisciplinary and more open than let's say the usual approach to architecture. They look to engage many different disciplines such as art, geography, politics, sociology, and economics to the ways in which we can understand and discuss cities. And today I will talk about shaping coexistence. And within this topic, I will look at the role of language in the way we can shape discourse about the city. This is a personal interest of mine, but it's also one of the topics that we've developed and addressed within Amateur Cities. And we did that in a project that was one of the first big research projects we did in 2016 and 17 together with an Italian organization, New Generations, where we interviewed 20 different professionals on and asked them to introduce different terms that they found important in discussing contemporary urban challenges, and they were related to topics such as economy and the creation of value, the role of technology in our daily lives and in shaping urban environments, but also our relationship with nature and also how we relate to each other as humans, as communities, and how do we live together. So this project was a very important start for us as Amateur Cities, but also for me personally to think of ways in which language can actually help us create new ways of thinking and new ways of discussing the city. And that also brought me to think, what does it mean to coexist? And this is also related to the fact that some time ago I've been asked to write an article that was a response to some thoughts that I shared in written form previously. And I've been then asked to write about coexistence. Then I actually realized that coexistence is quite a tricky word, because we usually understand it in a very positive way. Actually, when we think about coexistence, we imagine a really peaceful condition. But actually, coexistence means that we share a territory with others. It implies that there are some differences and that we have to negotiate this space, but it's unclear how do we do this. So today I want to talk to you about different forms and different concepts that define how we can do this. So yeah, how do we shape coexistence in the city, and how do we negotiate space, and how do we organize these concepts for ourselves? How do we define what is important to us? And what I think perhaps limits us in some way in the way we create these definitions are concepts that are about a century old and which created a certain conceptual framework for us, and pushed us to assign certain values to the way we shape how we live together. Those values reach to the beginning of modernism, and concepts such as, at that time, the revolutionary idea of the industrial city of Tony Garnier, which was created in 1917. And it's not like his concept was the only one in that time that defined such values, but it was perhaps the first and the most revolutionary at that time. And as you can see in this picture, it created different clusters of different functions that then, as we know, were translated to the way of thinking in urbanism about zoning, that the different functions in the city, such as living, working, production, would not mix with one another. But what I would like to argue is that this way of thinking went a little bit further than only separating industry from living. And this is what I would like to show to you today. So what do we think when we think about a good city? Actually, what we still think today is that a good city is efficient, is orderly, and it's hygienic. It's actually still a kind of machine-like city that was defined at the beginning of the 20th century, which is based on those values. And what I would like to argue is that those values were perhaps very important 100 years ago, but if we look at them a little bit more closely and carefully, it turns out that they are a bit dated and they might not serve us as well as we think they do. So let's start with efficiency and look a little bit what it means to us. This is a value that has been questioned already for quite a while. And one of the most prominent clashes around this value took place in America in the 60s between two figures, a city activist, Jane Jacobs, and a city planner, Robert Moses. It concerned grand modernization plans of Moses that were often related to the development of the automotive industry and the creation of highways. So the most important point that he was making was that a city had to be well connected and have a good throughput, but this connection was understood in a very different sense between Moses and Jacobs. Jacobs thought that the connection happened on the level of the neighborhood and the level of the street. And Moses saw connection in a bit of a bigger automobile kind of sense, and connected it to the freedom of movement and mobility. And actually what Jacobs argued is that this idea of an efficient city with a good throughput didn't actually always necessarily make it a good place to live. And she actually thought that this was quite devastating for those cities because it destroyed their livelihood and ripped apart communities. And what I find really interesting is the kind of rhetorics that they both use. And you probably cannot read it in this image, but what Jacobs is saying is that she's talking about eradication of the human in the name of hypothetically better world, while Moses is saying that the neighborhoods which Jacobs stood up to protect were actually inefficient, unhygienic, and therefore needed to be eradicated to make space for a 10-lane highway. And even though Jane Jacobs is famous and appreciated for her activism until this day, it's actually the ideas of Moses, who is actually often less known than Jacob's, are those whose legacy actually shaped our thinking about cities and what is good and valuable in the way we create them. And actually, it's really not uncommon today for poorer neighborhoods to be demolished to make space for the so-called progress, which often is seen in a very early 20th century industrial sense. So perhaps coexistence is actually not really always so efficient and orderly. But let's have a look at the second aspect, the aspect of order, and how do we understand it. And here I would like to introduce a perspective of two thinkers who've been important to me. And I think that their ideas help to better understand how the spatial and social dimensions define openness. And openness for me has a lot to do with how we coexist, with whom, and to whom are we open actually. How do we organize this openness and this negotiation of space? How do we shape it, or how do we order it? So on the left, you see a Polish educator, architect, and thinker, Oskar Hansen, who was mostly active in the 60s, but died in the early 2000s. And on the right, American sociologist, Richard Sennett, who writes a lot about the city, but also specifically about the open city. I think both their ideas are quite close to one another, but they show different perspective and a different nuance to what it means to be open and what it means to live together or next to one another. So Hansen defined this concept of open form. He contrasted it with closed form. So it was a very binary concept. And what he claimed is that they both represented very different values. One stood for, among others, dogma, hierarchy, and invariability, while the second one stood for science, egalitarianism, and flexibility. What I also find really interesting in Hansen's thinking is that already in the 60s, which is actually conceptually not so far from where we are right now, he paid a lot of attention to the relationship that we have with the natural environment, its devastation, and that actually building open cities meant to him also making them open to nature and to other types of non-human inhabitants. This is a quite detailed breakup of his values. He also related the closed form to the patriarchal values and the open form to the more matriarchal, more feminine values. They were quite detailed and very finely described. I'm not going to go into it, but this is just to give you an idea how well thought and detailed this idea was. Sennett, on the other hand, introduces also a binary concept, and he distinguishes a difference between what is a boundary and a porous border. And to explain this, a boundary for Sennett is a little bit like Hansen's closed form. It's fixed, it's impenetrable, and it stands for control and separation. It's a bit like this image of a boundary between a rich neighborhood in Sao Paulo and a neighboring Parasoples favela. There is no infiltration between the two. They exist right next to one another, but they have absolutely no contact with each other. On the other hand, when you think of this porous border, when Sennett explains it, he often uses examples of very complex places where a lot of different actors coexist in space and time. And they often do so in very intricate and even surprising ways, combining forms of living that we also may find weird in some ways. Like here in this train market in Bangkok, where a train passes right through the market 8 times a day. You would think that perhaps it's efficient in some strange way because of the way it uses space for different things at the same time, but it definitely wouldn't be considered orderly or hygienic. On the other hand, if we look at this picture, we are unlikely to think that this is a productive piece of land. We most likely will think it's a meadow or some kind of abandoned, slightly overgrown space. When we think of a productive landscape or an agricultural landscape, we also think that it should look a little bit like a factory. And what we see in this picture is an image of a permaculture garden. It's a garden where many different species of plants and animals and insects can actually coexist and occupy together one piece of land. And they do so because they live in a symbiotic relationship with one another. It creates a sort of a self-regulating system in which the plants actually help one another to thrive. They protect one another from pathogens. They create a good living condition for each other. And who would actually think, if you look at this picture without an explanation, you probably would not see much beauty or logic or value in it. And that kind of brings us to the point where actually understanding order is it's a cognitive task. It only depends on how do we define what is orderly. And we learned to define order in a way that is synonymous with separation and with monoculture, which actually we now learn to understand is not always good for us. And as French philosopher Henri Bergson used to say, there's actually no such a thing as disorder. There are only different types of order. And that actually means that only if we want to, we can redefine it and we can assign different values to it. And that slowly will grow onto us and will create this intuition that if we look at the picture, we will say, oh, this is good and valuable. This is this kind of order or that kind of order. So how about hygiene? It's a very important topic at this moment. And I don't think that any of us would agree that this is something that we should abandon or this is something that does not serve us. But I think the question is, how do we understand hygiene and how do we understand each other in relationships with other, with bacteria, with microbes, with viruses, etc. And I think our perception of hygiene is still much like in the 19th century England, or actually much like in our response to what was wrong with early 19th century or mid 19th century England, actually, when the Industrial Revolution was at a full pace. Back then, cities were actually really terrible places to live. Neighborhoods were overcrowded, there was no good sanitation, people were overworked. So diseases spread in really quickly, and they killed many people. But we have to remember that this is also the time where people thought that diseases actually spread through stinky air. And they were partly right, but the level of knowledge how to provide sanitation and how to create a healthy environment was actually very low. So this idea of disinfection, of cleanliness, also somehow grew on us to an extent that it maybe became contradictory to who we are actually. So if we think that in 1854, this was the first moment of mapping, like urban analysis, that is very well known to us at the moment, when John Snow mapped the cases of the cholera outbreak in London. And through this kind of urban visualization, he understood that the source of the epidemic was in an infected water well. So the response to understanding how diseases spread, how cities are organized, and how can we organize them better so that they provided healthier environment for people, actually led us to this vision from 1917, which we actually still live today. And even more so in a situation that we're facing now with the COVID outbreak, sanitizing everything, and also often blaming cities for being too dense, bringing us too close in contact with one another. But at the same time, we often fail to remember that it actually is because of how our cities spread and how they interact with the environment around them, that through expanding cities, we invade habitats of other animals, other species, and destroy them. So those devastated habitats actually lead to the development of pathogens that then create new diseases that we have to deal with. And we often forget that actually our relationship with microbes is not a relationship of conflict. We actually live in symbiosis. We are more than half microbes. So in a way, when we try to think of hygiene and cleanliness in a way that we need to kill all of the bacteria, we are acting definitely against ourselves. So when we think of coexistence, we have to ask ourselves questions: whose space is it, and who gets a void, and who gets heard in those spaces? And that doesn't only relate to humans, but it also relates to other species who live around us. And it's very important how urban growth conflicts with the biodiversity hotspots in the world. There are at the moment more than 400 cities that are located in the 36 zones that are identified as the most valuable biodiversity so-called hotspots. And the growth of 90% of those over 400 cities poses a threat to unique habitats, and majority of them doesn't have any spatial planning visions that include biodiversity values. So we also need to remember that this is something that should concern us as architects and spatial planners, and that we also have an agency to advocate for human habitats to be more inclusive also for other species, and to recognize these other types of order. And for a moment, I want to come back to the city as a human habitat, and a different kind of interests that also conflict in cities. And I would like to speak about the coexistence between the public and private interests in the city. And I want to talk about that because I'm really concerned about the disappearance of public space and space for diversity in many cities. Here we see a map of London with a number of so-called POPs, and that is privately owned public spaces. This map was created by Guardian Cities and Green Space Information for Greater London, and it shows a location of different spaces in London that seem like a public space, but actually are not a public space. They are not open to everyone and not for everything. What is allowed in those spaces is defined by their private owner. So if the owner doesn't like a certain behavior or a certain person in that space, they can easily prohibit them from being or doing what they would like to do in that space. So those spaces are per definition not public or free to everyone. The problem with that is that these are not just a few spaces that are clearly defined and that we can always understand which space is private and which is public. There are, of course, some more extreme examples, and London is one of them, where this is very widely spread and concerns really vast areas in the city center and outside of it, but most prominently around areas that you would think are really crucial to exercise democracy, such as spaces around the City Hall of London. And what is worrying is that this claim of public space for private interests is happening really in a way that we are often not aware of. So we also are deprived of our right to say something about this and to say whether we are giving this space away, because actually public space belongs to all of us. And this is, of course, quite an extreme example, but we have to remember that we see these examples all over the world, and also wherever we live, we have come across them. Spaces like this one, like gated communities or shopping malls, they are all examples of the same. And you might think that it's maybe a somewhat more mild form, but this comes through the fact that we feel in a way safer in those spaces. They are popular because people think, well, actually, then we don't have to deal with any unwanted visitors, with any unwanted behavior, but we also don't allow ourselves for this negotiation. We create an inflexible boundary which keeps actually the people whose ideas we don't like outside. And this takes also more extreme examples, such as in the country where I come from, in Poland, where like cancer, we see the spread of the so-called LGBT free zones. And this is also a form of privatization of public space on a larger scale, but not for the sake of commerce, but for the sake of ideology. So suddenly in cities and villages, you exclude whole parts of society from being who they are, and you exclude them from participating in this and being allowed to actually be in those spaces. You criminalize what you criminalize not only their behavior, but actually also who they are. So actually, what does it mean to be free, to be open, and to coexist? I think what is striking about all of those terms is that they sound very good. They are something we want, but we also often forget what they ask from us, and that they don't really come for free. They are not really a given. And last year, I was lucky to listen to a very inspiring lecture by a Polish film director, Agnieszka Holland, who was then invited by the International Film Festival in Rotterdam to give a lecture on freedom. And then she said something that that really stayed in my head, that freedom is also responsibility, that it's indeed not a given, and it often asks from us to give up our comfort or the feeling of safety. But we have to make a choice. What's more valuable for us, this comfort and safety or freedom? And I think it's difficult not to mention that in the last months, we've seen a lot of people taking to the streets to fight for their freedom. This is happening in my home country, in Poland, where women take to the streets to fight for the freedom to decide about their own bodies. And this has a personal meaning to me, but it's not only in Poland where people are massively protesting. They're also protesting for the freedom to choose in Belarus, but also in the United States, for the freedom to live, for their rights as equals, and also to bring justice to their oppressors. And why I say this is because, like, responsibility is a part of freedom. Conflict is also part of coexistence. We need the space for conflict, and we need to accept that it will be there, and that by embracing it, we actually search for a new paradigm of coexistence. And looking at words that I think can inspire us and open up new ways of understanding how we can live together, I came across the word pluriverse, and it's quite a complex word. I don't expect that anybody is going to suddenly start using it, but I think what is inspiring about it is that it talks about the possibility of being different and existing next to and existing together, sharing different spaces, but that are related, without having to clash. It's accepting difference, and it's bringing all of these different spaces, different concepts, and different values together. And I really believe that looking for new words and new definitions can actually help stimulate our imagination and the ways that we can poke through these kind of ideas that were so ingrained in our thinking that we stopped questioning them. We just think they're good per se, but that's not always the case. And I think a really beautiful illustration of what this kind of thinking about pluriverse can be is an artwork created by Sophie Warren and Jonathan Mosley, which is called the Rook Game. It's a game where 3 teams play simultaneously basketball, volleyball, and football. They share one space and one field, but at the same time, all of their fields, they're designated with all of these colorful stripes within the same space. And what this game really reminds me of is this kind of choreography that we perform in the streets in the time of the pandemic, where we start to be more mindful of the other and we try to give each other space to move. And this is perhaps not efficient at all. Sometimes we have to take a detour, but it does make us more aware of the fact that we share the space and that we negotiate the space. And I think, and I hope that thinking about space in this kind of framework can help us rediscover other values than the ones that have shaped our cities until now, and that we can look a bit more critically at them, but at the same time, we can discover new, inspiring, and hopeful ways of coexisting. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.